Thank you very much to Liz for inviting me to participate. It's been a wonderful day so far. So, I'll start with a story that sets the scene. This little story comes from the film Gosford Park, which I'm assuming everyone's familiar with, but just in case, it's Downton Abbey with a murder mystery thrown in. And there's a moment, a very small scene, in which one of the aristocratic figures, Lieutenant Commander Meredith, has fled the dining room. He's in his black tie and he's gone down into the maid's pantry. His life failures were on display in the dining room, and he's taken refuge, and he's eating jam out of a jar in his tuxedo. And one of the maids, Dorothy, discovers him there, and he asks her, why is it that some people's lives always seem to turn out right and other people's not? And she answers him quite passionately, quietly but passionately. She says, I believe in love, not just getting it, giving it. I think as long as you can love somebody, whether or not they love you, then it's worth it. And that little declaration is sort of the key to the claims that I'm going to defend. The idea that a lot of our meaning, a lot of our value, this sort of tracks something Lucy said earlier, comes from being able to be of use to other people. And so the first claim is that we have a fundamental need to contribute to the survival and the well-being of other people. This need can wax and wane. It can be stronger in some people than in others, but I'm saying it's not just a psychological desire. It's not just that we want to sometimes be useful to other people, but that it's sort of a feature of human beings, just like it's a feature to have 5 fingers on each hand, not all of us do, and so on. But it's a feature of human beings that we have a need, a deep fundamental interest in being of value to each other. And so in this scene, we look at this photograph and we assume that that's the man who is in need, but actually this man is being given a chance to be valuable. He's making an offer of support, and it might be rebuffed. And it's quite painful to us sometimes when we make that offer and we are rebuffed. And that because it's tracking a deep interest we have in being able to be valuable to other people. That's the first claim. Second claim is that we have a right. So I work in political and moral philosophy, and the concept of a right is a potentially potent one. You can get laws built up out of the idea of a moral right. You can develop policies from rights. So my second claim is we have a right to be protected in our efforts to support other people, to survive and have well-being. And the third claim follows from the second, and that is when we're denied the means to be able to try to support other people, we are often a victim of a certain type of injustice, which I'm labeling social contribution injustice. So when a father is put in prison for a long time with no regard for the fact he is a father, to my mind, that is a potential issue of injustice. I don't mean to in any way speak lightly of the seriousness of the wrong that may have resulted in this punishment, but he's not just someone who committed an offense. He's also a father, and we stretch and sever people's social bonds when we disregard that they are more than just the offense they've committed. I'll come back to that in a minute. So some people can protect themselves from this injustice. So if we have material resources, we can sometimes provide ourselves, I won't let you have that yet. We can sometimes provide ourselves a way of meeting this need to sustain other people. There was an article in the New Yorker in April on Japan's rent-a-family industry, where it talked about people who were lonely renting family members. And one image it showed was of grandparents renting a grandchild, people who had not had contact with a baby for a while, and who rented a son and a daughter-in-law and a grandchild so they could feel the contact of holding a baby, sort of have a moment of feeling they were a grandparent, a valued grandparent. And as you see, there's a very high price tag for 3 hours of time, $1,100 to hold a grandchild. It's a fantastic article. It's well worth reading. Now, this need to sustain others, it, to my mind, has 3 bases. The first is a fairly narrow image of self-interest. That we, in being able to sustain others, we give ourselves a bit of insurance. If we can be useful to a family, useful to a society, we're more likely to share in the resources, to have a secure place. And so it's in our interest to be useful, in a very narrow, self-interested sense. A slightly richer basis for this need to sustain others is that we have deep interests in the people we love, interests that they be secure, that they flourish. And if we are someone who can sustain others, then we're in a good position to ensure that our dependents are also protected and secure. And then a third basis is more broadly, as individuals and members of groups, parts of collectives, we have an interest that enough of us are engaged in the business of sustaining. Now, I think the thing that's most relevant to today's discussion on aging well is how we make sense of that need to sustain as we age, as some of our abilities might diminish, as our role in the center of families might become peripheral. What kinds of rights do we have to ensure that our need to sustain others, our need to be able to try to sustain others, is met? Now, not all of the aspects of this need are rights protected. We don't have a right that society provide us a friend so that we can be of value to a friend. And we certainly don't have that right if we have the resources to make efforts on our own behalf. So to give you an example, this is from, sorry, and again I'll deprive you for a minute, the novel The Enchanted April by Elizabeth von Arnim. 4 British, again, most likely familiar to most people, 4 British women, they rent a castle in Italy together for a month. This was published in 1921. And these 4 women are all lonely in their own way. And one of these women, Rose, she's married, she has a husband, she's somewhat estranged from him. And so she goes to Italy partly to reflect. And while there, she realizes that she's not contented. She's surrounded by this beautiful environment and she feels very ill at ease. And she realizes that she, in a way, wishes that she were needed. So the description von Arnim gives of her: Rose clasped her hands tight round her knees. How passionately she longed to be important to someone again. Not important on platforms, not important as an asset in an organization, but privately important, just to one other person, quite privately. No one else to know or notice. It didn't seem much to ask, in a world so crowded with people, just to have one of them, only one out of all the millions, to oneself. Someone who needed one, who thought of one, who was eager to come to one. Oh, how dreadfully one wanted to be precious. Now, there's something very tragic about that deep wish to be valued by someone, needed by someone. Rose wants her husband to need her, to recognize that he needs her. But she's not a victim of injustice. She's a socially able person. She can make other overtures. The one particular person who she wishes needed her Possibly we could talk about an injustice there, personal injustice in terms of what he might owe her as a spouse. But society doesn't owe her anything in terms of supporting her as a social being who can be of use to others. Another woman in the story is an older woman, Mrs. Fisher, and she's also able enough that her case, to my mind, doesn't come under the realm of rights protection. But she comes closer to an image of someone who potentially has some rights, some claims upon her society that it assists her in being socially valuable. So von Arnim says of Mrs. Fisher that all the loneliness of age flashes upon her face, the loneliness of having outstayed one's welcome in the world, of being in it only on sufferance, the complete loneliness of the childless woman who has failed to make friends. It did seem that people could only be really happy in pairs, any sorts of pairs. And Mrs. Fisher, at the end of the story, eventually does become part of a pair, and so we get a happy moment with that. But someone like Mrs. Fisher, an older, childless woman or man who is unable to get out of the house without some assistance, to my mind, they are in the territory of having a claim, having a right against their society, that they be assisted to sustain social connections and be of use to people. So in other work, I'm defending what I've called a human right against social deprivation. We have a right not to be denied minimally decent access to good human contact. And the obvious case, which most people endorse, is solitary confinement in prison. But a less obvious case is the incidentally isolated person who needs some help to stay social. To my mind, that falls equally under the umbrella of a right against social deprivation. And the right against social deprivation isn't just a right to have access to social contact so that you feel safe and secure, it's also a right to have the opportunity to be valuable to other people, to sustain other people. And so this is what I'm labeling social contribution injustice, that it denies us the space to contribute to our social connections according to our abilities. And it takes two forms. The first is when we compromise a person's social resources. In order to be valuable to other people, in order to offer our companionship, to offer love, to be a caregiver in a practical sense, we have to have some very specific and rich abilities. So a child who is mistreated, a child who grows up in appalling conditions, is compromised, probably throughout their life, in their ability to have those resources, their ability to be a caregiver, to be a companion, to make any assertive step to keep the connections they might have or to form new ones. Someone who is coercively isolated in solitary confinement, their abilities most likely are going to erode. The empirical evidence on solitary confinement is that it's a deeply destructive experience. It triggers our fight or flight response. It can make us hallucinate. We can become semi-catatonic. If we don't go that far, we most likely become self-abusive. Many people begin to have suicidal ideation. Many people do commit suicide. And between the incidentally lonely person, or the incidentally isolated person who's suffering unwanted isolation, their experience won't be as extreme as someone who's put in solitary confinement, but it will still have some of the marks of distress and illness. So there's correlations with higher blood pressure, reduced immunity, shorter lifespan, more vulnerable to diseases, alcoholism, reduced capacity for independent living, and so on. So that's the first kind of social contribution injustice, where we compromise a person's ability to sustain other people. And many people who lead that sort of incidentally isolated life are older people living in residential care homes. And indeed, some of those people you might classify as coercively isolated. People who wait each week for the visit from a health visitor. And one particularly destructive thing we can do to someone waiting each week for that visit is give them that visit from a different person each time. Because we then deny them the chance to have a joint narrative. We deny them the chance to be a witness to someone else's life, to return to, how's your daughter doing this week, or did you manage to get your car fixed? So that person's forever starting over socially if we don't attend to the fact that our connections are persistent, they're diachronic, they're joint narratives we build up with someone over time as we become mutually invested in each other. The second type of social contribution injustice is a prejudice. So the attitudes we have about specific groups of people in terms of their capacities to sustain others. Children are one such group. We tend to view children as socially needy, socially receiving, not socially giving. But a colleague shared with me some data on what it would cost if you replaced all of the social contribution work that 16 and 17-year-olds do in the UK. And apparently in a given year it would be over £1 billion of work. Taking care of younger siblings, helping prepare meals, probably taking care or supporting older family members, contributing to the social life of the family because they're engaged in paid work that then gives the family more leisure time. And it's in our leisure time that we have the chance to be hospitable, to return favors to neighbors, to show gratitude, to reciprocate. If a family's too busy trying to make ends meet and don't have space for leisure, they can't sustain others. So children are one case. Fathers, I've mentioned. People who've committed offences. Those two groups intersect. One claim I'm defending, specifically in relation to criminal justice, is that we should drop the essentialist language. And some prisons actually are trying to drop that essentialist language. So someone who commits a rape is a person who has committed a rape. The act is horrible. The act is egregious, and we must condemn it for that. But to reduce the person to the term rapist denies them a chance to see themselves as anything else. It reflects. It says, this is the most important thing about you. This is the only thing that matters, this act that you did. And this label signals that you're someone who's likely to do this, that this is true of your character, that you will do this again. And unfortunately, I don't have time to sort of fully spell out that thought, but it sounds like it links up with some of what Julian's been interested in. But my view is that in that language, we display a prejudice. So too in how we view many older people, the languages we use, the concepts we use to describe people. Okay. And just to flag one thing, I've got this slide and one more. Our social resources intersect closely with our material resources. And I've already gestured toward this, that when we are badly off economically, this compounds ways in which we might be badly off socially. That there's a corrosive effect to being in poverty, that we don't have the resources to rent a family if we need to. We don't have the resources to take the time to invite neighbors back for dinner. That there are many things we lose out on socially, this fundamental interest in being social, being valuably social, if we're economically badly off. Now, just one final slide. The thought is, philosophers, we don't do policy. So, I've sort of said there's some rights on the table. Society needs to attend to these rights. I haven't given specifics on what it's going to cost, whose specific job it is to make these things happen. We sort of say, go do this, and hope someone will listen to us. But one possible silver lining when it comes to our need to sustain, our need to contribute, is that even if our society lets us down, we can maybe keep a glimmer of a way of meeting that need. So, returning back to Dorothy, the idea that what matters is that you have someone to love you can actually meet that valuable interest of loving someone even if you lack many of the resources to be practically useful. So John Wooden, United States basketball coach for UCLA, he lived to the age of 99. He outlived his wife by 25 years, and he wrote her a letter every month of the 25 years that he outlived her. So, it takes an imaginative leap to think that he was sustaining her. But he continued to love. We can continue to love. And even when some of our analytic abilities begin to diminish, we seem to retain this capacity to love. And so we might be able to some extent meet this need, ourselves, even if our society lets us down. Okay, thank you.